That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Hola.
Hi, how are you all? Hello. If today is Tuesday, and it is, then this is Madrid, and this is the space of the Telefónica Foundation. And if we are also broadcasting and streaming for the whole planet, thanks to the work of Antonio and Guillermo, who are hidden there in the back, and Nacho, who's down here with the camera at the front, Jaime and Juanjo, who are using sign language, this means that this is another session of Vida and Martes. I've been looking forward to the opportunity to say that. Thank you, Andres, for this invitation. I've seen everything that's been done on internet with this season of lectures, because this type of meeting, and there's a hashtag for life on Mars, Vida and Martes. You can use that. But this is really a feast of culture with capital letters. These events talk about literature, music, science, technology. I don't know if you've had a chance of visiting the Telefonica website for the Spaces events. There are lots of very interesting things that have been held here over the last 2 years. I want to congratulate the organizers of the event for this opportunity, for this forum, this amphitheater that they've given us. But obviously, you're going to have to admit I'm right when you hear our speaker today, because he's the author of a fascinating book. It's this book here, The Sound of Perfection. I thought it was fascinating. And of course it's clear that I like sound. That's why I've been presenting radio programs for the last 30 years. A radio journalist obviously has a lot to do with sound. I do possible music on Radio 3 from 6 till 7 in the morning. It's a wonderful time to listen to a program that isn't designed to wake you up. And this music as posibles program is possible music, and that's why I was here a couple of weeks ago, 2 floors higher up. There's an excellent exhibition they have to see, curated by the curator who's here with us today. We had a wonderful time there. And it's an exhibition that you don't just see, you just look at it, you listen to it, you approach to it, or it proposes as an opportunity to go a little bit further as to how the sound was recorded. And it's called 1, 2, 3, Recording a History of Recorded Music. And it's a lot to do with this fascinating book that we're going to hear. As soon as I shut up, we'll hear from its author and also its translator. The translator of this book into Spanish, which has been published by Los Monk, which is not just a publishing company, it's also a record label. It's an independent organization we have to keep talking about and defending in this country. And he's not really a translator, he's another musician. And it's really everything so strange. I'm having great fun with these emotions. That's really what we're talking about. When we talk about sound and sound recordings, we're talking about recording our hearts, our emotions. And that's what is driving us to have a good idea and then make you a different person, someone. If you're even luckier, you become an even better person. These events take place on the Tuesday, and they're broadcast and streaming. And you got Enrique Flores here, and he's here, around the corner. He's drawing everything as I speak. But I must admit, it don't come out too pretty with it. But he gets the best sentences, the best part of our conversations, and draws them on paper, which is another way of recording and embodying emotions. And apart from his drawings, Tuesdays are always filled with questions. And those of you who've repeated here in this forum, you know we're talking about the martianos, the participants who have questions to ask, and also the questions that we receive via the Twitter hashtag, called hashtag Viva Martes. But I like to quote Sarah Cabanas, because these are all digital natives, 14 to 20-year-olds. I don't know if that's true, that they are or not. Maybe we should ask them what they think. It's Natalia, Fernando, Irene, Camino, and Edna, but they're probably busy studying for their exams, but even it's a busy time for them, they've come to join us to give us a different generation focus. And there's going to be a lot of support, a link to the master's course of the University of King Charles III in Madrid. They're my students too, and they know a lot about world music. I was with them just yesterday. And a translator, another translator, who's a musical producer and a musician from Pájaro Sunrise. He's just brought out a new record, which I can heartily recommend. And a writer who's really a journalist, or has been at least, and interviewed a lot of people. We talk about David Wren and Talking Heads. These are just the first few minutes in a short conversation I had with him. He was the director of String Magazine, and also has written in Rolling Stone, New York Times, The New Yorker, in The Guardian, and Wired. And the list is quite long. I have to cut it short at some point. But really, I'm a little ashamed or embarrassed to be beside someone. Pinpoints is a book about how GPS has influenced our way of understanding life. How technology has changed, but also how our brains, our minds have changed. And this book that's brought to us here, The Sound of Perfection, the history of recorded music, it's already been nominated for the Book Awards, is that right? And its first page is also worthy of many awards. It's just like the introduction of Gabriel Garcia Marquez' 100 Years of Solitude. It was just there standing in front of the firing squad that Colonel Aureliano Buendia remembered. And everyone remembers that sentence. But the first thing that the universe did was record a disc, record a record. Can't you just imagine? Everybody wants to carry on reading this. What's he talking about with that? So, from Honolulu to New York and to Brooklyn, now here in Madrid for just a few hours, I'd like to invite both of you up, Greg Milner and Yuri Méndez, to come up on stage and continue talking about the sound of perfection. A strong round of applause for both of them, please. Good. Well, first of all, we'll have to wear one of these things to be able to understand each other. Yes. I don't know quite how you're going to manage to wear it on top of the microphone. I don't know really which one of you I want to ask first. I want to ask you, Yuri, how you ended up in this. I know it has to do with passion, and for me, passion with respect to all these things we're talking about is a wonderful word. It defines very well why we're all here. Yes, that really was the reason. I want to say something else, because the publisher, Punk and Lemmy, of course, Punk and Lemmy, they're both here. Actually, how could I forget to mention him? Sorry. And someone over there, Borja, also told me about the book, and I read it. And I suppose that the book said a lot of things I already thought, but I needed to embody it, to crystallize it in the words. It strengthened my thoughts, and then I talked it over with Borja and Jose Antonio. We want to give this book to a lot more people who aren't able to read the book in English, or are too lazy to read it, or can't understand it. And at a time we say, well, why not just translate it? And this is what's brought us here today. So, Greg, I think you're extremely motivated about this, just by this passion. You're driven by a love of this music. There were lots of things we were talking about over lunch about how you were dared to do this. And it's been very curious. I mean, you're a journalist. You have to be a curious person by nature. Why are we all here, Greg? Tell us, what do you think of this? What has brought you to the Madrid city centre in the Fundación Telefónica space?
Question, but I guess the question is, it's why do we all care about sound? And this, I wouldn't have written the book if I didn't think that people cared about sound, even if they didn't think about it that much. To me, it seems like the history of music, looking at it through the prism of recording, was a really good way to see the totality of the history, because I noticed that the arguments that people had about music, about how records should sound, going all the way back to Edison, those same arguments were reproduced throughout history up until now. It was the same sort of struggles, the same kind of debates about what exactly a record should embody. And I think that's something that really makes us understand and appreciate music more, is if we think about what is a recording. I mean, the name itself implies capturing an instant. But of course, we don't really do that anymore with most modern recordings. So what does it even mean to take a representation of music, which is what a recording is, and call it music itself? That was really the driving force behind the book.
Yo no sé si Yuri en realidad, cuando se plantea hacer todo esto, sabía que se estaba metiendo en esto.
And Yuri, when you started getting into this tango, did you think things were getting away from you? No, it wasn't so terrible. I enjoyed doing it, but in my ignorance, I was very daring, and I really got stuck into it, and then it got harder and harder. But I really wanted to do it. For anyone who likes music, and people in the audience too, it's very important for people to have books like this, that they can have a different vision. This given a different position of hooligans about vinyls or CDs, whatever, and focus not so much on the medium but on the music. And music and perfection, it's hard to see them in the two words in the same sentence. It's hard to combine them. Is this really a book about music? I don't think it is. I think it's more a book about us, who we are or how we have evolved as people, and what has happened with human beings and the way that we face the world.
I mean, well, first of all, I should publicly thank Yuri for doing this translation. I'm in awe that, and I'm actually honored that you chose to do it. Thank you so much.
Well, my pleasure.
But yeah, I think I agree. At least I'm glad you thought that, because that's the way I saw it. I saw this book as being more about music, but being about what our appreciation of music says about ourselves. It always seemed to me like recording was a very unique art, because it can only be appreciated being based on the science and technology of that era. So you can look at it as a work of art that's dependent on science, but at the same time, it's science that really only makes sense if it's looked at interpretively, the way we can, and critically, the way we think of art. So that just seemed like a very, very interesting tension that I just don't think you find in other art forms. I mean, with cinema, the example that I make in the book is that, the early people who saw the train coming and the early films and jumped out of the way, they quickly wised up and realized that was not actually happening. And even today, when we see the Death Star blow up, we know there's no Death Star, but we still are wed to this idea of recordings as something that started from, you listen from the beginning and you go to the end, and it's supposed to sound seamless. And that's a fiction that we keep having to tell ourselves every time we listen to a record. And I just thought that was such an interesting way to look at it, in a very unique way. And like I said, it shows us much more about what we think about ourselves, more than just what we think about music, how we write that fiction.
Nosotros estábamos, llevamos un buen rato hablando de...
Well, we've been talking about this book for some time, but I don't know if many of you will have read it yet. Have you? A few hands up? Yeah, some of you have? Yeah, well, quite a few hands have gone up, actually. So probably you could have better questions than I will. But I'd like to ask you if you have changed when it comes to facing up to the challenge of writing this book. And I'd like to ask you if there was a first version, a flash of an idea that drove you to imagine why you wanted to write this book. And as you were writing it, have you changed in some way as you wrote it? I have the sensation that Yuri has certainly changed. I've got older.
That for a while I couldn't listen to music anymore because I just was too immersed in it, and it made me realize that certain records that I thought I liked, I didn't like at all, or not didn't like at all, but I just started to see what was wrong with them. So it in a sense, and that I got back an appreciation for music ultimately, but at first it really started to make me consider music in almost uncomfortable ways, because it's like there's a saying in the U.S. about you don't want to see how sausages or laws are made, and because of all the stuff that goes in it. And I kind of feel like I really got into how the sausage was made, and I didn't always like what I found out.
Grandes cosas que habéis descubierto. Bueno, tú traduces.
The great things that you've discovered. I don't want you. I'd like you to be able to tell Greg what you felt when you were translating this book. How is this process? How has this changed? How do you say you've grown through it? No, I didn't say I'd grown. I said I'd grow older. Not quite the same. Yes, a valid nuance. I don't really know. I think that when you're struck by something, anything really, but a book, it's that way of thinking is already in you, and it chimes with you. I record records, discs, and I work with musicians, and I like to do things like that with musicians. But most of the people, when they start hearing me talk about this, it's clear that my friends have some affinity, but there are other perspectives about music, about the way music works, about what music means for people, what people does so that we like it, what Greg was saying before. And I don't really agree with what people say, and it's what Greg is saying about how we understand music, and if you perceive that clearly, you can extrapolate it to many other things. And there's a level of informed tolerance about it, to explain the rational process of creating music, and once you've got the rational explanation, take it out of the way, and so that you can see what's beyond the music. That's not enough to take you out. You just listen to the music. And I think at the moment, when I read the book the first time, I needed that sort of reinforcement. I needed to believe that there was somebody else who thought like that. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
I think that's a very good explanation of what the book I think meant to me. So yeah.
Y un libro de estas características.
On a book like this, how do you sit down as a journalist and cope with a book like this? Sometimes we specialize in anthropology and musicology, but there are many anecdotes and many stories that go beyond all those fields. Perhaps the second part of the book is a little dense. I don't know if you agree with me, but there's a time when the book is talking a lot about emotions and so on, and we've all felt different levels of emotion with listening to the Beatles or whoever, but there's a level of seriousness and the recording. I like that very much. And so, how do you build that up? My question is how you sat down and wrote it.
Well, I was very intent on telling the story through stories, through narratives that help people feel like like for example, I talk near the beginning of the book about how Thomas Edison toured one of his phonographs around the country and ultimately around the world to do things called tone tests. And what those were is they would have live musicians, and say a singer would start out singing, let's say, and then the lights would go down while she was singing, and then the lights would come up, and people would find out that when the lights had gone dark, someone had switched it over to an Edison diamond disc. And so people were actually, when they thought in the dark they were listening to a live person, and that to me, it's a real challenge to describe that, because our ultimate, our natural inclination is to think like, what a bunch of idiots. Like, how could they possibly be that stupid? But the fact is that it was a very complex process. That probably some people liked the idea of being thrilled by it, of being fooled, and others really were thrilled and fooled by it. And I wanted to sort of communicate those sort of things through anecdotes. So to really try to get in their head. We'll never know exactly what those people were feeling. We just don't know. But it was interesting to me to really try to get behind and figure out like what might have been going through their heads. In terms of when I first sat down, I guess the genesis of this book came in when I wrote a paper about the transition from analog to digital recording technologies. And doing that paper, I had to do some broader research on recording history, and I was struck by how similar the arguments were. And so that's not the beginning of the book, that's the middle, but I started out from there as kind of like a jumping off point and thought, okay, let's find something that seems like a similar type of argument. And then I would, let's find someone who embodies that argument, which is, again, I really wanted to focus on people in this. And you're right, I absolutely agree. It can get a little dense maybe towards the end of the book, although hopefully it's still accessible. But I always wanted to keep it on that level of actual human beings having this human argument about art and science.
Pero de alguna forma, esa manera en la que...
But in some way, people were surprised at first when they read the first page, the story of the first pages of your book. It's the same thing happens with the new technologies every morning. How can this be sounding, playing my room? But it works. And it's been millions of hours been playing on CD players or whatever. But it's not just 10 years. We've got thousands of years. The way we do our programs on the radio, for instance. Are we able to understand it? And for deciphering how we are in this book, have you perceived this too? Is this a difference in the way or the tempos that we live in? Do we live in different times and different tempos?
I'll give you an example. Up until the invention of magnetic tape, which I talk about in the book, it's an exaggeration to say it was invented by the Nazis, but it's not that much of an exaggeration. But before magnetic tape, recording was about one thing. It was about reproducing a moment in nature perfectly, with a musical performance as it happened, something that was ephemeral, making it something now that lasts forever. And you want it to be as accurate as possible. Tape introduced this concept of basically turning the recording into a lie, and it's almost like hyper-real in a way, because now you could cut things up, you could overdub, you could make something that was completely detached from real life. And in a way, I kind of see that as being an example of us changing what we are, because we started to look for things that we didn't care so much about reproducing the real, this kind of very modernist attempt at truth. We started to head towards something like postmodern, if you will, something where our ideas of art and life could be something that was more focused on ourselves and what we wanted, for example, out of a recording, not something that was a perfect reproduction of nature. And in fact, in the early days of magnetic tape, the first recording engineers saw it as a way to reproduce things even more truthfully. And some of the early magnetic tape recordings are some of the most beautiful records ever made. And I'm talking about artists like Perry Como, like kind of forgettable artists. But the sound of these records as recorded in these big rooms is just fantastic. And that was the ethic of the audiophiles of that era, which, by the way, millions of people were audiophiles in the post-war era. It's a weird quirk of history that now we think of audiophiles in this sort of Nick Hornby geeky way, but there would be articles on how to set up your stereo in Better Homes and Gardens and House Beautiful magazines. But at the same time, this new generation was rising up with this new music called rock and roll, and they were using tape, not at first to cut it up, but to make sounds that were really distorted or crazy, like Elvis Presley, the slapback echo, which is an echo completely created after the fact. I mean, 1 second after the fact, but it's done with 2 tape machines, and if you were in the room when it was being recorded, you weren't hearing that echo. And it's interesting to me that we kind of still live in that rock and roll generation where now we no longer have as much of a fixation on the truth of a recording, but we think of it as something, like I said, more of an expression of ourselves.
En el libro...
In The White Bicycles, the book by Joe Boyd, this way we have of recording sound so that we know exactly when people have to clap, does that deform the way we think? Does that make us mentally programmed because of this type of situation? Or what happened first? Where's the chicken and the egg? Where did this all go wrong?
You mean, are we programmed in how to respond to a recording, do you mean?
Yes.
Question. I think it goes back to Edison. I mean, I think Edison, in a way, taught us how to listen. We're all sort of children of the tone tests, in a way. That was because it was a good example of how listening is something that we bring baggage to, because those people had nothing to compare to, so it sounded realistic to them. but in this day and age, it's a little bit, we're still somewhat programmed because we know how music is supposed to sound, and I put that in quotes. We know what the music is supposed to do, and then we can make our own decisions on whether we think that's true or not. And this is a reminder, by the way, I have to read Joe Boyd's book. It's been on my list. Is it really good? Is it,
Sí, sí,
yeah.
sí. Y estaba
See, I was also thinking about you, Yuri, as a musician. You're using these constructions. Just yesterday, I was reading on Twitter, Carlos, he's one of the directors of Sonart. He said, okay, maybe people are buying more vinyls, but are they really being used to listen to them? What do people listen to vinyls at home? I don't think it's a pose. I think it's a bit of everything. When we're talking earlier, Greg said something that I think there's a need for me. It's a necessity for my generation, and it's not just a generation. It's not just a matter of custom. There's still an impact for young people. There are products that you've got that object in front of you, and there's an emotional link, and it allows you to listen to music in a different way. I'm not saying that MP3 music sounds any worse or not, but as Greg was saying before, you might have the sensation that music is cheaper, it's more throwaway, so it's hard to consume music. You have to go there. It's not just a valid way of talking anymore. There are people who have the charm of the object, they like the object more than what it contains. However, I find it's very difficult that the physical format will ever disappear. I've been hearing people say that it's going to disappear for the last 15 years. It will change, of course it will change, but we have senses as human beings, and our senses keep us in touch with the reality, and we need those senses. I think there's still long life to the vinyls. I don't think it's just a pose. But that also has a lot to do with our age and how far we are from the things that happened in the past. One of the questions that Greg had for the martianos was what did listening to music give to them? What did it contribute? Just yesterday, when I was speaking with the students in the King Charles III University, I asked them the same thing. A cassette recorder, do you remember it? Do you still listen to cassettes, or has it disappeared completely from your memory? How do you see that, Greg?
Well, one thing that I find very cheering about the persistence of analog media, and I'm not going to stand up here and say which is better, digital or analog. It's analog, though, right? Can we all agree on that? But it's, no, I'm not going to get flamed on that. But one thing I like about it is that it shows this persistence. I mean, one weird thing about digital media is that in 20 years, we might not be able to play it. I mean, if you take a DAT tape right now, DAT was this format that probably a lot of people haven't heard of. It was digital audio tape, and it was very briefly a consumer format and a recording format as well. And now, today, good luck finding a working DAT player. There's the vinyl records you have, and the cassettes you have, for that matter, the technology behind playing them is so simple that they're going to be able to be played in hundreds of years. I mean, if I had to pick one of the most amazing facts that I learned when researching this book, one of them would probably have to be this idea that the technology of recording music, it could have happened hundreds or even thousands of years ago. That's how simple it is. All you need is a waxy surface, something sharp like a stylus, and a surface that'll vibrate. And that's all you need. It's as opposed to something like photography where you need lots of chemicals and everything. It wasn't done because nobody thought to do it, because sound was considered something ephemeral that's in the air. Around the late 19th century, a bunch of people around the same time kind of got the idea at once that it could be done, and Edison got there first. And what they invented is something so simple and so primal that those recordings will last. I don't want to say they'll last forever, but I hate to give the Scientologists any credit for anything, but one smart thing that they've done is they've buried in the desert, I think in Nevada or Utah in the United States, recordings of L. Ron Hubbard speeches on these discs with pictograms to show on a plate. So in a post-apocalyptic world, or maybe when the aliens come down, maybe language doesn't even exist, they'll see how to play these stories and play these discs, and L. Ron Hubbard's voice will last forever. So it's a depressing thought, but I appreciate the sort of ethic behind it.
Oye, permitidme, estamos viendo en la pantalla.
Pues on the screen we're seeing examples of the exhibition that's upstairs, 2 floors upstairs. You won't be able to see it today, but come back and visit the exhibition. So, Greg, what was that most surprised you about the exhibition that you've seen?
This wasn't so much as a surprise as just a reminder that how beautiful those artifacts were. I mean, you look at an old Victrola or even an old Edison cylinder, and they're just a cylinder player, and there's such beautiful examples of industrial design that you could see this exhibit and have no interest in the science behind it, although I think everyone should. But even if you just looked at these as works of art, they're so just impressive looking, and they show a sort of commitment to style and design that we just don't see anymore. I mean, you probably can't tell, but I think that's a blue amberol, right? Is that, yeah. I mean, and there was a reason that escapes me, that this was an Edison cylinder. It was part of his failed attempts to keep the cylinder format going. He thought because cylinders sounded better, people would like them rather than discs. Discs, however, were more convenient and cheaper to make, and so and that was the original format war, and Edison lost. But for a while, he had these blue things, and they're so cool looking. I mean, I don't know how else to explain it, but there's this beautiful shade of blue, and yeah, I think so. That's the thing that really jumped out at me, is seeing all these things at once, just how amazing they were, just as artifacts.
Y de todas formas también estos libros quizá y estas exposiciones, porque todavía hay mucha gente.
And anyway, you can do this way because there's lots of people that still have those objects. There will be a time in the future when these will disintegrate, disappear, and we will not be able to get hold of these objects. What will happen then? And we will talk about books as well. We have a conversation about music. We can also talk about books. Will books disappear in paper? I mean, will that happen to a lot of material things? I'm afraid that we will be spending the next 40 years in conversations about what will disappear. Perhaps we will disappear ourselves.
I mean, well, books are an interesting contrast because books are fragile and they do disintegrate and the paper yellows and it falls apart. One thing that I think a lot of people don't realize about analog media, and frankly that includes like even the cylinder we just saw. The cylinder is delicate, but it's not that delicate. I mean, a cylinder can still be played today. A vinyl record or even a cassette tape is very, very durable. I mean, I talked to someone a recording engineer who still uses cylinders. I mean, he does things like he'll do corporate events and parties and stuff, but he's a real serious collector, and he's telling me he has a house that's out on the Long Island Sound. It's kind of, you actually have to take a boat to get out to it. And it was flooded once, and all these 78 RPM records, so they were fine. He just dried them off. A cassette, if you put it in, I think you have to put it into a food dehydrator or something, every 50 years or so. It's going to last forever. Those magnetic particles, not literally forever, those magnetic particles are really durable. So in a way, I think we ourselves are going to maybe last less time than these recordings we've left behind. And so maybe that's a good thing. I don't know.
And perhaps you have questions yourself. I'm glad we're not making an interview as such. But anyway, I know that there are some questions from our Martians in the room. You have lots of questions. I've seen you writing, and I know there's some. And we also have Enrique, who has been drawing. Yeah, he keeps drawing all the time. And at some point we'll see those drawings. You promised me you would show them to us. These are the images captured by Mr. Flores. Well, we're talking less than usually. Here, there's many more comments in those drawings in other events. So who starts? Who breaks the ice? Is it Greg asking the Martians, or is it the other way round?
Yeah, I'm curious, how many of you have ever heard music on a physical medium, something you can hold in your hand, the actual music itself? I mean, are there any of you who have never actually heard it? Most of you have or have not? Oh, yes? How often? Not that often, though, probably. Yeah, related follow-up, one more. How often do you exchange money for music? Actual money?
I mean, personally, I buy music by iTunes. I don't buy it physically. But anyways, I still have some CDs and cassettes, and I know how to listen to physical music, not just on my phone. I don't do it that usually, but like usually I don't do it, but I like it. Like I prefer it to do it, like to see and to put the CD on the recorder or the player or whatever I'm using, than to just plug my headphones in my iPhone and listen to them.
Why is it a better experience, do you think?
Because I feel it's more like natural, like, I don't know, I feel like I'm more into the music than when I'm just like in the street, like walking around. Yeah.
Damos por terminado.
So that would be the end of that question, perhaps? Anyway, you need to ask now. It's your turn. This goes both ways. You were alive when music was listened to in vinyl records and tapes. I mean, you come from that time. We're still alive and kicking, by the way. So how do you listen to music now? I mean, is it in a digital format, in an analog format? Is it a combination of those two? I thought you meant crying or in a certain mood.
I mean, it'd probably make a good point if I said I only listen to physical or even analog media, but I don't. I mean, I listen to Spotify like everyone else because it's pretty amazing. It seems almost wrong that I can spend about the cost of 6 or 7 CDs and for a year and get what seems like 90% of the world's music. But it's great to be able to carry it around on my phone. I live in New York where the apartments are small and I share it with 2 other people. So there's not really many times where I can just sit and listen to music on a stereo without bothering other people. So yeah, I listen to a lot of digital music.
I'd like to know also Yuri's opinion about this. Well, I'm very anxious, so I listen to all formats you can imagine, obviously including Spotify, not iTunes. I think the girl next to you is the only one buying from iTunes, but in vinyl records as well. So it depends on the time, the room I'm in, what I'm doing. So each thing has a time. Any more questions from any of our Martians in the room? We have questions from the floor as well, from the general public. Can I share the time with some of this as well? Whatever, should I ask? Yeah, go ahead. I'm also a great fan of music, not as much as you are, obviously. I play saxophone, and I have the impression that when I listen to that instrument, to a saxophone, it sounds very different from when I listen to it in recordings, especially when compared to other instruments like a guitar or something like that. It may well be because I'm a really lousy player. That's perfectly possible. I'd like to know, is there any type of instrument specifically that sounds more reliable when it's reproduced in a recording? So when you listen to a record, something that is more realistic, I don't think it has to do with the instrument, but rather with the type of recording. Let me put it this way. I don't think there's such thing as a realistic recording. It might be the volume or the dynamic range. Before you have a shock wave, you can reach up to 196 decibels. In a CD, the limit is 96. In a vinyl record, it's 75. You need to find a way to compress everything onto that scale. When you have more instruments, you start perceiving the sound not as the individual sound coming from each individual instrument, but as a relationship between the instruments. And when you are mixing the sounds for a record, you have to pay attention to the execution, of course. So, but you need to sacrifice, you need to compromise somewhere. You do not have to be a lousy player, but you need to know about the voice of the instrument, the way it sounds. And obviously, there are trends at different points in time, but from my point of view, there isn't such a thing as a realistic recording of sound.
Touch on a very interesting tension that involves playing music, because in the book I interviewed one of the founders of the first record label to release digital recordings. This was right before CDs. They were on vinyl, but they recorded digitally. It was a classical music label called Telarc. And I was talking to him about the analog versus digital thing, and he said, you know, if you sit right in front of a violin, it has a lot of bite to it. It really jumps out at you. If you listen to it on a vinyl recording, everything you hear on vinyl is being, if you take a blank vinyl disc and you put a needle down on it, you hear like, and that's called pink noise. And everything you hear on a record is being filtered through that is, and it kind of, the way he put it, I don't know if this will translate, it feathers the edges. It makes things sound like it gives us, that's what we perceive of as warmth. His argument was that that's not really what a violin sounds like. If you like that sound, that's fine. But if you're going to talk about the way a violin realistically sounds like, his argument was like, we think we captured it better digitally, but even though it sounds, it's got that harshness that people associate with digital music.
Una última pregunta.
One last question from our Martians in this block. I'll go back to you after that. My question goes to all of you, really. At what point and what musical technology would you have chosen if you could have lived throughout the 20th century with any type of technology available for you? What would you choose from the 20th century? Nothing from the 21st? Well, the 21st is where we live now. Yeah, it's good, but let's go for the 20th century.
Yo quiero ahora, me gusta ahora.
I like it now.
I guess, I don't hope this isn't cheating. I'd like to go back to the early 20th century, but with my ears, and find out what it really sounded like, and compare and talk to those people. I think actually also it would be great to live through the early hi-fi recordings on magnetic tape, because I really think that was a big leap forward. Again, even though a lot of the artists themselves were pretty forgettable, if you can find stuff on Columbia Records, a lot of that stuff was recorded in a studio in New York City that was an old church, recorded by engineers who learned the craft and science often in World War II. And to them, it wasn't an art, it was purely a science, but what you got from them were these records that just sound gorgeous. And I feel like it must have been really amazing to hear that then, especially if you could then contrast it to, say, a Sun Records, like rockabilly record a few years later, where it just sounds like it's assaulting your ears, and like, what is this? So, yeah.
A mí me habría gustado.
I would really have liked to attend live events, listen to Nick Breck, no recordings, just being there, like Forrest Gump, but being me, okay? I have a question from Murcia in southern Spain. From the time of Edison, I was still doing the same. Do we prefer comfort and quantity rather than quality? What is quality?
Quality in a recording. I think quality in a recording is a record that sounds like the way you, the listener, want the world to sound like. I mean, a recording is sort of a utopian opportunity to really like make something sound the way you wish everything sounded, and I think that's what a perfect recording is.
Hay muchas cosas.
There's lots of things that are mentioned in this book on sound and perfection. Hi-fi, the 50s, life in the States in other times, and then remixing and the concept of reinventing modern music. You talk about lots of things. There's an interesting chapter on how 9/11 had an impact on so many things. What impacted you most? I mean, what struck you most? What do you really think made you say, wow, I would have never thought that this way of doing things would have taken us where we are now?
There's something I talk about in the book called the loudness war, and I won't go into all the details of what loudness is, but it's what it sounds like. It's the way we perceive the volume of something has to do with tricks you do called compression, where you compress the dynamic range, the difference between the softest part of the recording and the loudest part of the recording. The reason that when, for example, if you're watching TV and the commercial comes on and the sound seems to jump up, is it's not being put out at any more power than the show that you were watching was. It's just that the show has a dynamic range that was going up and down, whereas this commercial was just all up. And that makes things sound louder. It was fascinating to me that loudness was something that, what the loudness war is in the 90s, there were roots of it before that, but really in the 90s, records just started to get louder and louder and louder because everyone wanted them to sound louder on radio. If your song sounded like really wimpy on radio, the people were afraid you would turn it off. So you got to the point where things were getting so loud that they were really, really compromising the sound quality to me. Like we were going backwards is a perfect example of how we were going backwards as we went forwards. And there are other examples of that I found in the book, that there's all these things where in moving forward, we're actually also taking steps backward, but we as a society decided that the steps forward were worth it.
Yo creo que
You were talking before about the second half and how it can be more dense. And there is something really essential, which is the chapter on Quintabi and Jamaica. And deep down, I'm not sure there is a gap. You talk about a number of things, how you started gathering different layers of sound. If you listen to that record, it's just like sound from another planet. It's really strange. Perhaps in Jamaica, that part of the book shows what music has become now, especially the gap, or the gap between recordings and live events, and how recordings, instead of being limited to a realistic capture of an event, it becomes something abstract. So I think that precisely what music of our time is, in terms of artistic content, is precisely that. Suddenly, it stops being natural music. It becomes something else, where there's no fixed rules. There's no fixed rules on how it affects people, on how emotionally it impacts people, what makes you feel. I'm really interested in that part. And I think that's the key. That's the key for the entire book.
¿Algo que añadir?
Anything you would like to add?
It's good you brought up King Tubby, because to me what struck me as King Tubby is he showed that one record could be a million records.
Yeah.
Which magnetic tape kind of suggested that, because you could, in theory, just layer things to infinity. But with King Tubby's techniques that today seem so basic because we've just assimilated them all, it really showed that like this record could be millions of records. You could keep remixing this for eternity and never run out of options, really.
Estaba terminando de escuchar al traductor.
I was just listening to the interpreter because I need to choose the language. Anyway, there was something that came to my mind. Do you think we are slaves? In general, I think we are slaves of many things. But are we slaves of sound? If you know what I mean. How we let others manipulate us through so many different ways of treating sound nowadays. Why manipulate? Well, because really we are so conditioned, and we accept those conditions. Greg was talking about the different levels of loudness. But I mean, for a Renaissance musician, what Baroque musicians did was crazy. They were not open to certain rhythms and certain tonal approaches. It always happens. Rather than being manipulated, when we get used to seeing something, it stops existing. We need a change. What you can call manipulation, you could call the life of music. Yes, but it is also true that you are referring to the artistic component. You may understand or not. Minimalist music, Michael Nyman may sound horrible to you, or he may sound like a blessing, on both things in the same record, really. But I was really referring to the use that is being made of music and sound in all sorts of things, like advertising, commercials. I mean, because we are being conditioned to keep buying things. Yeah, but I think we become a bit resilient against that. It may well be that for a long time they've been using music and audio. They've been trying to impact our behavior, and there's lots of people doing coaching out there on how to sell, but I think in the long run it loses its ability to impact us. I'm seeing this from the point of view of music. Yes, there may well be a peak where the impact is maximum, but it's like a snowball that melts after a while.
This is a little different than what you're talking about, but again, to go back to Edison, people being fooled by it. you know, I like to tell people, you know, if you think it's ridiculous that those people fell for it, just like right now, you know, think about how a human voice sounds. Just like really think about it. Then turn on the radio to any song on a, you know, on a rock or pop or hip hop station, and then think about what then really listen to the way the voice sounds, and it probably sounds very little like what a human voice in your mind really sounds like. But you've been conditioned to not ask that question because this is how recordings sound. Like, so things that are auto-tuned, you know, into infinity, if they're done right, you're not supposed to question that. You just kind of accept it because that's one of the conditions of listening to music today.
In any case, I was also referring to, haven't you noticed that nowadays when you're watching television, when you hear the news, there is a sound in the background which is so similar between the networks. They're giving you the weather forecast, and the way they speak, it's amazing. It's becoming just one way. I mean, everyone is doing the same, and it's unbearable. It's becoming more and more unbearable. I know that there might be people listening to us all over the world in the streaming channel. I think that is happening. I think we have a homogenization of things, and everything is becoming the same. It affects sound.
Actually, Alan Lomax worried about a lot. This kind of, it seems almost naive now, but he was the great sound archivist. That the spread of all this technology was getting rid of local cultures. Everything was being flattened out into this like one sort of generic soundscape. And I think, again, it's not something we think about too much, but you're right, there's a way in which everything kind of sounds the same. I mean, and if you want to talk about on the level of technology with streaming music, there is less of a sort of tonal palette, right? I mean, there's less because there's more compression going on. The data compression, not dynamic range compression. Yeah, I mean, there's certain ways in which I think the life of the aural, AURAL life of our lives is being flattened a bit.
I think there are some Martians that are willing to ask a question. Yes, I'd like to know your opinion on who or what must the evolution of devices rely on? The devices, the platforms we use to listen to music, both analog, digital, and physical.
What do they rely on? Well, I'm not sure if this is the answer you're looking for, but I mean, I find that they rely on, above all else, they rely on convenience. You know, time and time again throughout history, the format that sounded better was lost to the format that was easier to deal with. And that, honestly, I think that's really what drives sound formats, is how easy it is for us to integrate it into our lives, not how good does it sound.
Listening to you, something comes to my mind, in that music would be the best invention, the best artistic creation ever made by man. Because we're talking about something truly universal. It brings us all together. Everyone loves music, one sort of music or another, and devices make a contribution. They bring us together in listening to music. But then, reading an article that you published in your blog, Yuri, back in 2011, I started reading your blog. I saw that you wrote an entry in your blog saying that you were considering the possibility of leaving music and going somewhere else. Thinking of music as the best human creation, what were the reasons why you decided to go away from music and then come back? The reasons, well, I didn't want to leave music. I wanted to leave vans and hotels and gigs in lousy places, but I didn't want to leave music. I wanted to keep performing, but I didn't want all those things that are not part of music, part of the essence of music, like, for example, buying records. Things that I loved doing, I didn't want to leave behind. I just wanted to take some distance. Okay, just being there rather than being where I am now. I think that if you like music, you cannot stop liking music. If you know what I mean. But yeah, you really need to take it directly. When there's no interpretation in between, everything is much better. We have images from Mr. Flores, drawing expert. we can see them all at the end. I would have chosen another hairstyle if I had known that. Anyway, we got some questions. I think you're done with your questions. It was one question per person. Or is someone still waiting? I did want to tell you that some of my former students, I don't know where they're sitting. Where are you? Right, any questions from my former students? I know that we have 2 musical experts from the group and someone from the general public. You probably know that you may participate. You can send. You can use a hashtag to post questions using Twitter for Yuri and Greg. Who has the mic? Right. Hello. Hello. Good evening. Along the lines of what you were mentioning on analog and digital stuff, not a question, it's really a comment that is clearly related to what we have been discussing. Today, Bob Katz, who is a widely acclaimed sound recordist, sound engineer, said something in Facebook about an investigation that was carried out by the Engineering Society, or the Sound Engineering Society. This investigation was carried out by through the Technology Institute of Hong Kong or something like that. In the investigation, they say that a group of people studied MP3 and the compression algorithms used for MP3, which forced the emotion away from music. And they were studying to what extent that compression had an impact on the people that listened. So how much the compression applied to MP3s hinders emotions or becomes an obstacle to emotion. It's quite a revealing investigation, because what these guys have found out is that the higher the compression we have, the fewer the emotions that are perceived, so to say. And they go one step beyond. What they have noticed is that since MP3 came to our lives, since MP3s came to the market, this is more of a speculation probably, but it's quite striking. These guys say that since MP3s got to the market and they became mainstream, the music that has been produced since then has become much more violent and much more simplistic. So this is quite striking, because people of my age, well, we usually say, well, music before was better, and now it's much more difficult to find really good music around. It was just, I read it and I said to myself, this is exactly what has been happening. Probably music has lost quality in general terms. It was very striking because of all the things behind the scenes. It was not just a nerd in an isolated fashion. It was a widely acclaimed group of experts. What is your opinion about this? May I? Well, the first question is, how can a study measure the emotions? Well, there was an explanation in that paper. These researchers had established, they looked at something very simple. They investigated a number of classical instruments from classical music orchestras, and they would play music from those instruments with different compression ratios in MP3 format. And there was a group, like a focus group of people listening to that. So they established a scale to measure. And when they made the compilation of the feedback they got from those people listening, the conclusions they reached, I didn't read the entire paper. I don't know what the methodology was. I just read the abstract, and basically this is what I'm telling you about now. And the authors said that it was like a scale with an emotional score. And they found out that when compression went up, people started perceiving less emotion in music. It's rather striking to me. Greg, in the book, without getting into measurements or things like that, and without saying that music before was better, I wouldn't agree with that, by the way. And then we should consider from when does music stop sending emotions to people. But we need to take into account lots of things, cultural things, the stress level people have nowadays, the way we devote time to music, lots of things at the same time. I've lost my own drift, but anyway. Bearing in mind that it's impossible to measure, I think it's like a superstition with science and measurements. And Bob Katz, yes, he's widely acclaimed, but he's got a very specific way to look at music. And perhaps it's not applicable to everyone. And then what I was going to say something else. Greg mentions this. If you do a blind test and you play a WAV file at 24 bits, 4416, MP3 320, 160, I've done it. And I think I can hear reasonably, and it's quite surprising. You don't necessarily like more whatever has less compression. It depends a lot on the type of recording, and perhaps an MP3 at 128 has a compression which for a certain equipment gives you a lot of energy. I don't know. There's so many factors coming into the equation of your listening. I wouldn't trust literally whatever anyone has to say with a certain paper. That is usually a justification of their own premise. Yeah, I understand your point. I'm not defending the conclusions. I'm just saying that it's quite striking. Because in actual fact, bear in mind that one of the things that is happening now is that the new generations, those young people that have never consumed music in any other format, I mean, we know we have studies out there where young people say that they prefer to listen to music in MP3.
I'm going to interrupt this wonderful conversation to ask the young people in the audience whether this is true or not. Those of you who are under 18, please. Anyone under 18 who is not one of our Martians? Well, I'll ask you if I have to. You're privileged. But is there anyone else in the room, in the hall? Some under 18 or under 20. No? What have you got to say? Okay. What was the question now? I see. The question is, how do you prefer to listen to music? I've never heard a song or album on vinyl, ever. I have heard some cassettes and things, and records. I've got lots of records at home, but the most accessible that I've always had access to is my phone, internet, Spotify and other platforms like that, and the CDs that you can plug into the player in the car. We don't have a CD player at home because everything is available on the internet. So I prefer to download it and play it like that. Because I've got the player in my pocket. But I've always liked having the opportunity to sit down and listen to a vinyl record properly. And listening to a vinyl record peacefully, let me just pursue that. What kind of music would you want to listen to in that situation? I don't know. What I mean is that perhaps I've had the opportunity to listen to Red Hot Chili Peppers, for instance. I've never seen a vinyl by them from the 80s, but I had the opportunity of buying in vinyl of one of their more recent albums, but I've got it on a shelf because I don't have anywhere to play it. So if I had to choose, I think I prefer the digital platforms nowadays because it's handier and better, I imagine. Okay, last question. I have to. Do you also listen to the radio? I mean, I was afraid you would say that. No. If I've got my phone working, it will be listening to music. Thank you very much. I knew that was a question. I'm not going to ask you which radio you listen to either, but some people have said Or you were telling a story before that I don't have music on CDs. I don't listen to CDs. Do you remember what it was? Which musician said that? I don't remember who said it.
Bueno, no importa. ¿Alguna vez
It doesn't matter. But somebody says that I don't have that and I'm never going to have it and I'm never going to listen to that format. Have you ever said that to yourself and then go back in your word?
Well, there was something funny about CDs that just seemed to promote that kind of discourse. And I can remember I avoided buying CDs for a long time. And it's out of some, I'm sure even at the time, I vaguely defined reason that I don't even know now why it was. And since then, I don't think I've ever said that. I probably never guessed that I'd listen to streaming music as much as I do. If you asked me like 5 years ago, I probably said no way. So I guess when I think about it, I guess I've done that a lot, and I haven't really thought about it. But yeah, there are times where I just can't see myself listening to something, and I do. So.
de alguna forma siempre
And the other thing that we say is that the video killed the radio star, Spotify destroyed the way we listen to music. They're always killing the one before, and it never dies off. And sometimes honouring the things that we leave behind, but we never stop. That's the sensation that I have, at least, and also when I read The Sound of Perfection. That's the type of thing what you've been talking about.
I mean, I had a very fascinating conversation with Yuri just a couple hours ago about the title of the book and how the title in English, I guess, just doesn't translate well into Spanish. It's in English. It's
really for me.
Yeah, no, I think it's perfecting sound forever, and that was an actual, well, supposedly a slogan used by the developers of the CD to advertise it. It turns out that's somewhat of an urban legend, but the idea behind that is that you're constantly perfecting sound. Like we're never going to reach the point where we record sound perfectly. It's just, it can't be done because there'll always be a different way to do it. And the thing with digital music is a good example. I'm sympathetic to some of those studies. I find them fascinating for no other reason that with an MP3, they've literally taken out 70 to 90% of the music. I mean, literally taken it out because psychoacoustic research has shown that at any given moment we can only hear certain frequencies. So if they take out the frequencies at that moment that are being masked and just leave the other ones in. So they have science on their side, but then you can't help but think, like, how can you remove 90% of something and still think it's all there? And that's what's always been frustrating to analog enthusiasts from the CD era until now, is that there's always been the digital people always have science on their side. They can always point to something that shows objectively that that we're not losing any sound, that something isn't, but there's so many of us that it just doesn't quite seem to make total sense to us that can be the case.
I don't know if we have any more questions there. Yes, there's a hand over there. And the hashtag too, don't forget, you can send your messages that way. That's not the end of the world. If analog music disappeared and we're only left with digital music, lots of industries and jobs have disappeared over the history of music. It is not the end of the world. I don't see a problem with not having analog music anymore. I'd be sorry for the industry. There are phone operators, and now there aren't any phone operators and the switchboard operators, so life moves on. Yeah, but we're talking about the valves in the radio, not the musicians. Anything to add to that? The world is not going to end if we stop producing analog music. I agree with that. But we will be losing something.
I think literally, I don't mean to be dogmatic about it, but the point I made earlier really, you talk to engineers and it's something that they really are concerned about, is that digital formats. Like, one thing that people like about computers and computer technology is that they evolve so quickly. But there's a downside to that, and I wasn't exaggerating. Try to play a DAT tape now. If I handed you a DAT tape, good luck finding someone who's got a machine to play it. So this has actually become a thing among archivists, an actual issue, where they worry about what's going to be able to be played in 50 or 100 years. So no, I don't think the world would end. I think if we totally threw away the whole idea of analog formats, we'd be losing, quite literally, being at risk of losing a lot of music. I mean, obviously it would never disappear, but it would become much harder to re-access.
De todas formas,
But in any case, digitalization is causing a lot of problems as well. We heard during lunch about what digitalization means and the cost of doing this, people working on it. Nobody can put up with that. In Radio Nacional, where I work, I have first-hand information now. We can't afford to receive lots and lots of collections from the label company because we don't have the capacity to respond to them. When somebody's got a wonderful collection of discs and we don't know what to do with them because we don't have the physical space to store the records, and we know that that material can deteriorate, but can it be digitalized? Is there some way of doing it? Is somebody doing it, or is that going to end up being lost?
I think there's always people digitizing stuff, and yeah, I mean that's obviously one of the good things about digitizing is that space really isn't an issue because computer space, disk space is easier to find than shelf space, right? And I actually didn't realize that. I thought that was really interesting that you actually have that problem. So yeah, I think things are constantly being digitized. It's more just like I hope it's not happening so fast that people aren't thinking about what's going to happen to the originals. It's and whether or not, and regardless of whether we care about having the originals, whether we're going to be able to play the music that we're digitizing.
hay también.
There's also another added problem that not everybody really understands what they're scanning, what they're digitalizing. Some they're just copying discs or tapes or whatever, or open reels. They don't really, unless you record who's actually singing or playing what is being recorded. You have to identify the singer, the afternoon, or the date or the time of when it was recorded. The archivists did a lot of work with José Manuel Gambo in Spain, recovering flamenco music. There's a whole collection of records that he's produced, and I know that he's had to say these are not the artists that appear on this record. The documentation is wrong, and so when that disappears, what's going to happen when all the information is digitized and that documentation is lost? We're going to lose our identity of who we are. But that's not a new problem. Even before digital media existed, there were collections of songs collected in the field, and it was you lost the documentation of who was singing or where before you produced a master in vinyl. But that's something that happens with not just in music, but also in writing, and it shouldn't really be a problem. If the music has a value and the music's still there, then that's what's important. I don't think anything's changed in that sense.
I think that's accurate. I think it's just it's an ongoing problem. I mean, of course, you have people like Neil Young, who in the early '90s said, "We'll look back on the digital era and say, I wonder what that music sounded like. We didn't record it. We just made digital records of it." So that's someone like him. He considers that we lost all these years. But yeah, I think you're right. That's the idea that's an ongoing problem that actually predates digital media.
Que hemos ido solucionando, ¿no? Paso a paso.
Okay, I was asking when I met you, Greg, I was asking what was the first album that you listened. We were talking about that for quite some time. I don't know if you want to admit it in public.
The first one I remember listening to, and I might be making up the memory because I've been told about it, is the Joe Cocker record that was his big hit. The first record that I owned was the Eagles' Greatest Hits, given to me by my father when I was really young, which now it turns out I think pretty much every American owns. It seems like it's become, I think it's the biggest record ever. So then the first record I bought myself was Kiss Alive. So it's
Las cosas verdaderamente van cambiando.
Things are really changing. Because We always ask specific questions to the people we interview for our program on television, and back in the date of early TV days. And one of the key questions that we asked, what was your first musical memory? And almost everyone had a song, apart from the Mamas and the Papas or something like that, but there was a song that had to do with the sounds that they had listened on the radio. Everyone referred to the radio, but nobody didn't. I've been asking this question for 10 years, and now people are not remembering it on the radio. They're not associating that initial memory with the radio, so things are changing in that area too.
When I was younger, for a while, I was convinced that one of the first songs I ever heard had to be Until the End of the Day by the Kinks, because there was just something about it that I would hear it, and it was almost like a memory that I couldn't access, but was right there. And I remember asking my parents, and they said, "No, we don't even know that song." But there was, I thought I had to have heard that on the radio. And in fact, I also used to. I say used to because once I realized I could do this, I stopped being able to do it. Is that it used to be that when I heard a song whenever I heard a song, I would immediately flash back to the first time I heard it. But I wasn't even aware I was doing it. Then once I started to notice it, I lost the ability, weirdly. So.
¿Y tú?
No, mi primer recuerdo no es de la radio y hace más tiempo.
My first memory is of my parents playing records at home. Do you want to talk about records? I think my first memory is Loli Emanuel, flamenco record, and I remember the greatest hits of Queen. I think that's probably the first album I bought, a vinyl album. There weren't any CDs at the time, at least not CDs or near where I live. Okay, we're getting to the end of this time together. I'd like to go back to the Martians. I'm sure there are a few questions from you that you want to contribute to close the session. Have you got anything to add? I'd like to ask a last question. Well, maybe not the last. If Edison were alive today, would he still be fighting for analog recordings or digital recordings?
I think if Edison was brought back from the dead, he would be. I think the sound of the world would just kill him again, because Edison hated the microphone. Like you can divide the history of recording into the acoustic era and the electrical era, and we're still in the electrical era. It's basically the era when the microphone was invented. And this is actually, it sounds crazy, but it makes a certain amount of sense. Edison thought that the microphone was an abomination because in his mind, acoustic recording, which is basically shouting into a horn and having the sound waves imprint, imagine your hand imprinted on wet cement. To him, that was just going to get better and better and better and better. And with the microphone, you weren't making things more accurate. You were introducing all this noise and distracting things. And you were introducing this illusion that you could record the sound of music in a room, the sound waves bouncing around, not just the sound of the music itself, which is what you got out of an acoustic recording, a very dry, non-reverb sound. And the Edison, that was perfect because it was just pure music without any distractions of the concert hall or anything else. And Edison was a record person, which a lot of people don't realize. He had his own record label. And it pretty much went out of business largely because he just wouldn't sign the right people or put out the records on the formats that he should have, that people actually wanted to hear, because he thought it sounded terrible. So I can't even imagine what he'd think of that. I think it would just like fry his brain or something.
Martiniano.
Any more questions from our Martians? Adding a final comment or something? Well, I was thinking, Greg, since your last book has to do with GPS, and you were talking about it has influenced the rest of technology and the way we think, in a book like this, can we only think about GPS? I mean, can you tell us about that transition that took place?
How I started to work on it. Part of it was, like I said, for a while after doing this book, I couldn't even listen to music anymore. It was just too much. But GPS was something I started to notice that was everywhere and all around us. Everyone used it. Nobody really knew what it was. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized it permeated every aspect of our lives. I mean, the lights right now, the electrical grid is being regulated probably by GPS, by the time code that GPS gives us. So it started to seem like, wow, it's just something like, maybe this is kind of like the sounds of music, where it's just something that's affecting us in ways we don't even think about, and actually affecting the way we see the world. And it turns out, without going into too much detail, that it is. The other thing I want to add, if anyone wants to keep asking me questions at all after this on Twitter, it's G.I. Milner, it's G-I-M-I-L-N-E-R. Put the hashtag, put the hashtag. It might take me a few days, but I'll try to answer everything. So
Pero
feel free.
contesta siempre.
But you respond always, yes?
Hay una cosa.
This one thing. How did it occur to you to pose the preface of the book that way, with that statement? The first thing the universe did was recording a sound. When did you realize that? Was that an earlier conversation you had with someone? Because it seems like you had it very clear in your mind.
You know, I honestly don't remember how I came onto that. No, I really don't. I can't remember if I was looking for, because I had heard about, oh, you know what I think it was? I think I at the time remembered hearing something about how microphones could pick up the sounds of the Big Bang. I remembered hearing something about that. So I looked into that and then found out more about the Big Bang. And it was one of those things where it just like, everything kind of clicked. You know, it was like the opposite of writer's block. It actually made me want to write more. Because, yeah, I mean, I won't go into too much detail what I mean when I say that the first thing the universe did was make a record. But essentially, things like sound waves froze in place after hundreds of thousands of years in a way that almost like seems like a record. And in fact, at some point, the astronomers talk about how I think it's after a few 100,000 years, the universe recombined. And I thought, oh, that sounds like remixed. So it's like, and so I just took it from it. It was one of those just very sort of happy accidents where I pursued something that I vaguely recalled, and it turned into something much bigger.
Desde luego, hay vida.
Yes, there is life on Tuesdays. It is absolutely true. Even on Tuesdays 13, which is the unlucky day of the year, Tuesday 13, Greg was struck by something. He was struck by the impact of this book amongst people in Madrid, the people he had met, and people in Spain in general, compared to people in the States. I think that you can blame Yuri for that, Jose Antonio, Borja, the people that have been pushing to make it possible that the book was translated into Spanish, Sound and Perfection, by Greg Milner. But I think you've had some time to reflect, at least 5 minutes, on why in some countries better than in some others.
I don't know, people here have better taste than in the United States. I don't know. You know, it's really, I've actually been puzzling over that, because it also was better received in the UK. By better received, I just mean it sort of seemed to generate more of a kind of emotional response. And this is, in Spain, it's the Spanish version has definitely garnered the most kind of like enthusiastic response, or I would say emotional response in a way, I think. And I really don't know why, unless maybe, I don't know, maybe in America we're just so addicted to artifice that we don't even think to look at what the artifice is. We don't have that sort of questioning. I don't know. I wish I could give you a better answer, but it's been very, very interesting, very surprising.
I have another question. Rixilan says that after getting to know that your first record, what is the difference between the first time you listened to it and the next times you did that?
Like this first and second time of any record or any?
Sí, supongo que sí.
Yes, I get. He doesn't say anything about a specific record.
When you first saw them in concert.
Oh, when I first saw.
Yes. Yes, yeah.
You know, I can remember when I was younger being very, very into REM. As I know someone who's here today probably was too. And I can remember seeing them live for the first time. It was I think it may have been it wasn't the first concert I went to by myself, but it was one of the first where I didn't have to go with my parents. That's how young I was. And I remember it took me like literally years to admit to myself that was pretty bad compared to the record. I just could not, it just didn't impress. Like, it must be me. But once I really made that, fully accepted that, I realized that recordings were, they're supposed to be this introduction to the artist, but they can also kind of be the last word on the artist, because even something like R.E.M., and that we're not talking about a very manufactured band, but even they could like sound not as ideal to me when I would see them actually play their songs than listening to them. So.
Tengo aquí otro.
I have another tweet here on digital platforms. What do you think about recommending bands through big data? Well, it's got a good thing to it, a very good thing. You get to know about new groups that you might like, and there's a really negative part, which is getting to know about groups that you probably will like. So both the same thing is both positive and negative. I don't know if it happens to you. It happens to be all the time. Perhaps those things that I really like, I tend to reject at first. It is risky, because you might get into a niche and stay in that niche, in that small space forever. I mean, if you get all of your music from there, from that source, you might not be curious enough. If you do it in a different way, you might be curious about other bands. But as always, it depends on the usage. Yes, apply to everything, absolutely, not just the music. Greg?
I actually, by big data, talking about like you might also like the things like when Spotify tells you, or yeah, I think it's pretty fascinating. I have a friend who was obsessed with I guess once a week Spotify will make a playlist for you called Discover or something. Yeah. And he was just obsessed with it because it felt to him like it was reading his mind. And every song that they gave him that he'd never heard before, he liked it. And then I tried it, and I was like, I don't know, I guess I kind of like this stuff. What's better, actually, is their recommendations for when you exercise. They have like I run sometimes, and they have a runners, like where they pick songs they think you like, but also have the same beats per minute as your stride. And I thought, like, wow, this is a really great application of this. Like, this is smart. This is why I'm actually glad to be alive now when we have this crazy way of listening to music. It's like, yeah.
Todavía tenemos alguna pregunta.
There's another question from that part of the room, and we are getting close to the end. Well, I had a very simple question myself. I'm more or less young, and to me, artistic creation has always been about being realistic, in being similar to my favorite music, to what I listened on the internet, creating music that was similar to what I liked. So, reading the book, one of the things you notice is that this is not always the case. There are people that compose music, that put music together to see how it sounds live, and in the opposite situation, how to translate that to people listening to me. The question is, do you think that both things will coexist better in the future? Will things get modified as they are recorded? The last part of your question, will we always try to resemble what has been recorded, or will we ever go back to the previous situation where the live performance goes in parallel with the other stuff? I was saying this before, these are two very different things, and I think we need two different approaches. As you go into more live performances, you identify certain problems or certain things you would like to do when live, but then you spend a long time listening to recorded music. When you're at home, you have something to record with, a computer, whatever. I guess the main reference would be records that already exist for creating music based on them. And we might think that some part of our creation comes from live and some part comes from records. But we might have an influence from the smell of French fries. Believe me, it's lots of factors getting into the same equation. It's like reaching something that is in your mind and translating it into something. So recorded music, live music, together, and our aspirations, I think we're rationalizing this after we create music. But I don't think we will reach a balance, or a clear balance, or a clear-cut situation where people will be very clear about how to create. I think it's about meeting our own expectations on how to create music.
Rage, I should say. No, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I don't see us going back to. It's an idea of whether like recordings will imitate live music again, or as opposed to live music being trying to reproduce
Like
recordings?
creation, actually, not only.
Yeah, the process of writing and making music for the first time and writing songs.
I would trust your opinion on this as a working musician more, but it seems to me that, I don't know, I don't mean to, that's a very good question, and I'm not sure. It seems to me that there are always going to be musicians who compose first and foremost with the idea of playing the songs live. I don't see that going away. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I think you can have like different approaches to music and the way you write. And I guess that it has to do with what you want to get from your playing, but volviendo solo
Going back to creation, it sounds like a big thing. I don't know. If you don't have a purpose, apart from creating music, I don't think it matters. If you have other objectives, other goals, and you want to achieve other things, perhaps it would be an interesting idea. Well, I now have to say, well, first of all, lots of acknowledgements because there's lots of people working hard behind the scenes. Of course, to Greg and to Yuri, a big thank you for everything, for the book, for the translation. Thank you to Borja, Jose Antonio, and thank you also to our master drawer. We have all his drawings uploaded to our website in that URL. We will be uploading the entire talk. I've had a great time myself during this event. It's been a privilege to count on you. Having Natalia, Fernando, Irene Camino, Andrea, Netna. As always, I knew about you through the screen. It's a privilege to have you there in person. I'm probably forgetting lots of people. Andres, Ana, Cristina, Elena, thank you very much indeed for making life so easy. And of course, Antonio, Guillermo, Nacho, who have been working around, Gemma and Juanjo as well. I'll probably forget names. My apologies. But allow me to say that sound and perfection can go hand in hand in the same phrase. I think it has been made very clear after this brief encounter with Greg Milner and Yuri Méndez. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you all.